So, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to our panel discussion. Our theme is facilitating global trade and transport, and I'm joined by an interesting panel, both in terms of the background of the individuals and the mix that the panel represents in terms of the topic. To my right is Minister Mahmoud Ben Robdane, who is the Minister of Transport of Tunisia. To his right is Deputy Minister Louis Levesque from the Department of the Ministry of Transport, Infrastructure and Communities of Canada. Beside Minister Levesque is Theo Zweigers, who is the Supply Chain Director of Lindendale Basel. So someone with a hands-on experience of supply logistics in plastics, chemicals and refining. Then we have Mr. Gaozhang Zhu, the Director of Compliance and Facilitation in the World Customs Organization. And finally, our fifth member of the panel is Klaus Tilmes, from the Director in the World Bank. Thematically, and here I am not in making a few comments restricting the conversation to anything I say at the outset, but we're going to be looking at the quality of logistics, an opportunity to look at customs procedures, tracking and tracing possibilities, overall infrastructure, and what I might describe as logistics competence, so not just physical capital, but human capital development also. It's clear that a lot of these elements to do with quality or lack of quality of logistics has an even bigger impact on trade than distance has or than freight cost has. So it's an important issue. We know that there are lots of non-physical barriers to logistics, delays at ports, delays at borders, absence of standard procedures and so on. And there have been lots of initiatives in bilateral and multilateral agreements to try to address these. So again, we'll have the opportunity to exchange some views on this. So without any further remarks from myself, I'm very pleased et j'invite le ministre tunisien de prendre la parole. C'est à vous donc d'élargir le...
You are welcome to go into detail of this topic as you prefer. Thank you very much, Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Good afternoon. I am very pleased to be a member of this panel discussion, and I am also very pleased to be a participant of this important forum because for me it is the first opportunity of exchange with other countries since we have had our new government. Less than 4 months ago, I was given this important task, so this is for me also an obligation as a minister of Tunisia, and I am very pleased to take on this challenge. I actually translated that into a question to Tunisia. What is Tunisia's contribution? I took a look at your question and the topic of this panel discussion, and what I can see is that it does relate to logistics, but especially when it comes to all means and modes of transport, and especially those modes of transport that connect my country to the rest of the world. Maybe, ladies and gentlemen, I could say in advance that my country, Tunisia, is currently in a phase of transition or leaving that phase, which had lasted for years. And whenever there is a political transition and a development, we realized that the institutions themselves are questioned, that the government itself is questioned. We had 5 governments within a period of 4 years in our country. And for all means of transport, that means actually a step back. What is the important task now is to rebuild the country, because now we have a liberal constitution that contains all the liberties and equality of all citizens, and we now have a nation governed by rule of law, and that is the very center of our constitution. That means, in other words, that now we have a strong government. This government enjoys a lot of trust. We have a parliament in practice. The parliament has confirmed the government. More than 3/4 of all the delegates have placed their trust in the government. And now it is about rebuilding a democratic Tunisia. So I will not talk about the surface-based means of transport. I will talk instead about the connection that we envisage towards Libya and towards the west and the north, that is towards Algeria. This is a very important project. We're talking about a road project here that we want to realize, but of course it will require a bit of time, a lot of time actually, and it is quite costly. What else do we do in order to connect ourselves to the world? As for aviation, we want to modernize all our airports. Apart from a relatively new airport, in Anfida, it's a rather new airport, and for this airport we have a license that we awarded, but our politics, our strategy aims at developing and modernizing our airports and focuses on doing so quickly. That means that within a year we want to take a look at Tunis Carthago and want to expand the airport capacities. And then there will be a second expansion so that we will be able to hand 10 million passengers until 2021. Of course, we are very far away from Mexico, but because we only have 11 million of inhabitants, so you have to see it in proportion. But in proportion, we are talking about the same capacities that we are planning. As I've said before, there was a transition. We did have difficulties. All public companies were forced to deal with these problems, and they did have problems. There were social movements, and this did become a problem indeed. But now we have an infrastructure in place that has to emerge from the crisis. And at the same time, we have to make sure that we continue negotiating with the European Union so as to make open sky happen. This is a process that is going on in parallel. It is a process dealing with our relation to the rest of the world in terms of aviation. As for the airports and the ports, they're also part of this program. And talking about ports, we will modernize all our ports, especially Hades. We want to enlarge the capacities of the port, and we want to be able to receive container vessels. But what is even more important is that there is a project that had been in our drawers for approximately 10 years, and that project is that we want to build a deep sea port in the region of Elfina so that Tunisia will be able to become a hub between Africa and Europe and towards Asia. To put it into a nutshell, this is what we want to do. This is my answer to the question that you have asked, and this is what I actually read from the title. This is our contribution to facilitating trade and transport. And to conclude, I would like to say that Tunisia does not have a lot of natural resources. The only wealth that we have is being open to the world. And throughout history, since Carthago, Tunisia has been an open country, and it has always contributed to global exchange. And this is our wealth. Okay, thank you. That has been an overview, and it is quite a challenge that you're facing, enormous, but it also is an enormous hope, because there are truly difficult times behind you. You've just said that you now have a very modern constitution, and it has been adopted. And I have to say that this is remarkable. It's exceptional if you take a look at the other Arab countries since the Arab Spring. In Tunisia, you can consolidate the development. And you have just said that there are different institutions such as, and facilities such as airports and ports. And Tunisia, of course, is not a wealthy country as such. So what are the needs that you see? What are the capacities that you need? What do you need from the World Bank or from other banks? What is it that you need in order to make it all happen? This is a very good question, because the process of transition is something that involves social movements becoming very strong and being very strong, and there were a lot of social demands. The deficit was rising and rising, and we tried to cover the most urgent needs. And we are dealing with a situation where we still have a deficit nevertheless. But nevertheless, our debts are not so high. We have 51% of debt rate. So compared to other countries, it's not so high. And if growth decides to come back, then we have a situation of financial sustainability, taken that wealth will be started again, and growth. So Tunisia accepts universal values of fraternity, openness, and Tunisia needs the help and the support of the international community, because Tunisia belongs to the wealth of the world. Just imagine that to the south of the Mediterranean, Tunisia wouldn't be there. The nation of Tunisia wouldn't be there anymore. And just imagine that the same kind of chaos would prevail in our countries, then the entire region would be destabilized. And this is why I am saying that Tunisia is a global good. The entire world has an interest in Tunisia developing in a positive manner, and Tunisia needs the support of all the international institutions. Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you for having described the Tunisian situation.
You're very welcome again. I'd like to have your opening remarks about the state of play in Canada. The quality of logistics is very high, and you've got a very big competitor just to your south in the United States. So it's very interesting to have some sense of the dynamics of that competition and the capacity of Canada to maintain its space and to develop its business in such a context.
Thank you, Mr. President. Going back to the previous speaker, it's hard to have a more different contrast between a developed country, a developing country, a stable government in a very difficult political situation. And Canada is blessed with every natural resources you can imagine in terms of in its territory. So there's a context that is different, but there's a fundamental policy orientation that is very similar that I'm hearing Minister, which is, in the Government of Canada's perspective, is that fundamentally long-term prosperity of Canada is dependent on trade, its openness to trade, and it's critically related to the ability of our transportation system to move the goods in an efficient and cost-effective way. And so that is, I think, similar in that respect. And so that driven policy makers in Canada will be very focused on first establishing the legal frameworks to trade agreements with all the key markets. We have obviously the NAFTA agreement with the US, but we've just negotiated an agreement with the EU, and we are working on the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. We have an agreement with Korea. We're negotiating with India and Japan. So one pillar being the kind of the legislative framework into the regulatory framework. Other pillar is adequate investments in infrastructure. For the last 10 years and now in terms of new infrastructure plans being in place, there's a commitment to invest in terms enough to build up from the public infrastructure side enough of the capacity. But that being said, I think its key message is this is your ability to succeed critically depend on the full integration and the change from the regulatory framework, from the investment infrastructure, and the effectiveness and efficiency of the logistics. All the elements have to work together in an aligned fashion. And what we found is that is a critical role not only for government to work on the infrastructure or the legislative side, but also to work to ensure there is enough in terms of discussion and identification of where the bottlenecks are, because your chains are as strong as your weakest link. And that led to a couple of initiatives that have been taken. Obviously, and with the demand in Asia, a focus has been on the Pacific Coast to improving, to ensuring that we can capture in terms of we can service the demand that's out there, but also get the products in from a container perspective. And we have worked over the years and put significant money, not only money, but also investments in terms of convening the actors, getting in terms of the data on the table, and getting the data shared, have a shared understanding, so that we call this the Asia-Pacific Corridor and Gateways Initiative, to ensure that our chain moving products in and moving products out has been is efficient, and we made significant investments over the last 10 years. We also cannot talk about trade and transport in Canada without talking about our relationship with the United States. In terms of growth, clearly the growth is in Asia, but we still have 75% of our trade that's with the United States. And so we have been working with the U.S. administration on both in terms ensuring in terms on the customs side that we have as much exchange of data to facilitate movements at the border, but also in the movements of persons. We just did conclude with the United States pre-clearance agreements that will ensure that we really facilitate even further the movement of persons with the U.S. Looking forward, we are now in the process of reviewing our transportation legislation with a view to ensure that our regulatory structure enables in a proper way the exchange of data in real time, so that there is an understanding of the needs in the systems and what the bottlenecks are. We had a particular situation recently with shipments of grain because of a huge crop that really showed we still have a ways to go, both in terms of ensuring that the actors make the investments, but also that the government plays its role in facilitating the effectiveness of the chain. But clearly, trade being at the core of the government's kind of policy agenda, these are elements where we see continued action, both in terms of new infrastructure investments on the public side to build capacity, creating the framework for the private sector investment, but ensuring that all the elements in the facilitation change are kind of aligned.
Let me ask you, you've talked about the wide range and increasing territorial extent of the trade agreements that Canada has negotiated. To what extent, in terms of the chain that you describe, is your investment policy in key infrastructures directly a consequence of the trade flows you're presuming to generate by these new agreements?
I think we have made significant strides. Again, with the Asia-Pacific Gateway Initiative, we have really shored up our infrastructure on the West Coast. But what we understand in a world of globalized supply chain is it's more complicated than that. And you really need to ensure that all your infrastructure is put to an adequate level, but you also need a fine understanding of the impact of trade flows. I'll give you an example in terms of, obviously there's increased metal demand into iron or other base metal demands in Asia. And so if Canada is, let's say, the marginal supplier of that because our mines are relatively high costs, and when the price go up, we become a kind of viable supplier, people naturally think that product will move from east to west to the West Coast and then exported to Asia. That's not necessarily how the world will actually work, because there could be a mine, for example, in this case, that in South Africa, that's actually supplying Rotterdam currently, and there's increased demand in Asia. What happens in the transportation network is that the mine in South Africa will now supply Asia, and we end up supplying, Canada end up supplying Rotterdam. So it's actually going on the East Coast.
Sure.
So the point here is, we know the source of the demand, but we don't know, it's not obvious without really a significant investment in, in understanding the flows, how that demand is going to be served, and then what are the consequences on the infrastructure needs. And I think that's certainly the message for us is we need to intensify our partnership with the private sector to be in a better position and to understand and anticipate where the growth that everybody sees coming from Asia will translate in demand on our infrastructure, on our transportation sector, and then the impacts on the needs for infrastructure.
One of the things you mentioned, I would just like to explore that the pre-clearance agreement that you mentioned for movement of persons. Can you describe it in operation?
We have a number of airports where if, for example, you fly from Ottawa to a city in the U.S., there's a customs office, U.S. customs officers at the Ottawa airport. So you're basically pre-cleared in Canada to fly into the U.S. And we have that at a number of our major airports, and we want obviously to expand that because it's really into facilitating the movement of people. But we now have a broader agreement signed with the U.S. that apply not only to the air mode, but applies to, in terms of the marine mode, but also in terms of land border crossings, which would facilitate and we discussed that yesterday, how do we get to more risk-based approaches in terms of the border, obviously trusted travelers kind of programs, expansion of those. We are expanding these types of programs with the U.S. All of it obviously in the view to facilitate the legitimate movements and focus the kind of enforcement and compliance resources on the higher risk and of travelers or in terms of freight.
Which is interesting, in effect, to accept that the great majority of travellers should be de-risked because they're regular, and then you focus the heavy security attention on the high risk.
Yes.
Okay. Theo Zweigers, it's not that I want people to be stereotyped in the panel, but given the context of your moving very large flows of materials around the globe and your long experience in the sector, your private sector sense in this kind of ITF environment, dealing with governments, dealing with multinational institutions, international institutions, what are the key observations and key messages that as a practitioner you would like to emphasize, or the key issues to do with policy making that you would like to see addressed?
Yeah, as an industry, we move goods around the world, and we produce around the world. And so for us, it's extremely important that barriers are brought down, that we create green corridors so that we can freely move goods, and so that we have that we take away the barriers so that real competition can take place. In the end, is better for everybody, because it keeps also, if we take barriers away in Europe, Europe will be forced to become competitive, and will be able to compete. So maybe not in the short run, but in the longer run, it will be better able to compete on the world markets. I can give you a few examples, for example. Today, if I take a ton of material from Amsterdam to Paris, it costs me more money than to take it from Amsterdam to Shanghai. That's the reality. If you look at the amount of repositioning of containers, the flow of empty containers is a bit like what you were mentioning in Canada. Like on the US side, you can go from the east side of the US, it's much lower cost to go all the way through the Panama Canal and go up to China than to take it by train across to the west coast and go across. We ship materials, I'll give you another example. We produce a lot of materials in Saudi Arabia, where feedstock is very low cost. We ship from Saudi Arabia for $16 per ton the materials into China, which is much lower cost because we pay double if we go from South Korea to China, and that's just across the strait. And so these type of flows are, and with the world becoming so small with the bigger ships, means that you have to take these barriers away, or countries are sliding behind. So the only way is that we confront these competitive environments, that we break down those barriers, and that we go through the painful exercise of forcing our economies to become competitive. And if you can't survive, then maybe you don't deserve to be there. It's unfortunate, but that's with a world that becomes smaller, that's the way it's going to be. And so, as an industry, we strive for removing as much as possible and as quick as possible all trade barriers.
And so the removal of the trade barriers is the classic trade agreements and so on is the key dimension you're describing. To do it, say more operational barriers. Can you describe what kinds of things you run into to do with customs procedures, ports? I know you've talked about some examples there, Amsterdam, Paris, West Amsterdam, Shanghai, which is very interesting. But when you move so much around the world, without asking you to name it, the places you would avoid and why you would avoid them. So those barriers.
There are certain ports that we avoid. So I work for a company that's listed on New York Stock Exchange. We have very strong compliance needs. And certain ports I'm not able to go through. Impossible. Because I will not be able to do it in a clean way. And these things need to be tackled. So these are barriers, and they are difficult. And most people know where these ports are. You avoid them, or you deliver CIF. You bring it to the port and you hand it over. So these are problems. In some countries, there is a huge level of bureaucracy. If you go to some of the underdeveloped countries, or also some of the countries where there is still a lot of paperwork, that all could be done electronically. Here, I think also customs, and but also the main shipping lines. So if you look at the big shipping lines, they've all standardized. It took a long time, but they all standardized on a 20 and a 40-foot container. So that was done. But if you look at the different systems used today, we talk about well over 100 different systems that you have to communicate with, and there is still today very little standardization. So it makes it also very difficult to deal with all the compliance requirements. So in that area, there's still quite a need for some standardization, for some standard protocols that we can all agree to comply with. So.
Thank you. Well, that's perhaps a nice segue to your neighbour, Gao Zhongzhu, on the question of the international customs procedures. To take up the point, really, and that challenge about standardization, the kind of the one-stop shop, one facilitative document argument.
Okay, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. So for customs, it's always the topic when we talk about trade facilitation. So the WCO, as a standard setting body at the international level, has been at the forefront in facilitating global trade and securing the supply chain. So WCO instruments and tools play a very important or vital role in supporting trade and transportation facilitation. So here I would like to take this chance to brief you on some of the key instruments or tools of the WCO. So the first one we would like to mention is that the RKC, they revised the Kyoto Convention. So it's quite familiar with you. It is, as a matter of fact, it's the Bible of customs procedures. So it is the harmonization and simplification of customs procedures. So to help the customs administrations to simplify and harmonize the procedures, the standards. So just as mentioned, now we have 99 members have access to this Kyoto Convention until last week. Palestine, the latest one is Palestine. Yeah. So another how to say flagship tool is a safe framework of standards. So this is very important because it provides a set of global standards to the customs administrations in strengthening their effort in securing and facilitating global trade in a harmonized manner and with a strong partnership with private sectors. So another thing I would like to mention to the WTO has done is in response to the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, you all know, concluded in Bali last December 2013. So the WTO, besides developed the implementation guideline, has launched a strategic initiative to support trade facilitation, so known as the Mercato program. So it is aimed to assisting governments worldwide to implement the trade facilitation measures expeditiously and in a harmonized manner by using core customs tools and instruments, and provides tailor-made assistance, technical assistance, and capacity building programs to the members. So also recognizing the complexity of the border regulatory requirements, so of different government agencies, the WCO has also been promoting coordinated border management, so-called CBM. So by enhancing the international engagement, developing various tools, and supporting a one-stop shop at the border. So seeking greater efficiency over managing trade, transport, and travel flows. Of course, while maintaining a balance with compliance requirements through enhanced collaboration among all the border regulatory agencies. So this year, the theme of the WCO is coordinated border management. So it is an inclusive approach for connecting stakeholders. So if we're moving furthermore, we have added a new pillar 3 in the SAFE framework. I just mentioned the SAFE. We have a coordination and cooperation with private sectors. Now we are trying to involve other agencies, government agencies on board. So we established the 3rd pillar to foster closer cooperation between and among government agencies. So ensuring an efficient and effective government response to the challenges of supply chain security, while at the same time facilitating legitimate trade. So the WCO also encourage a single window environment. So our goal is one filing, one verification, and one release. So in order to deal with growing international trade, the WCO has all along been advocating a risk-based approach, based on advanced electronic information to target the high-risk cargo, conveyance, and traveler, while extending enhanced facilitation to others by using modern information and communication technology. So at the same time, the WCO has also addressing extensively those issues related to regulatory procedures, redundancies in documentation and data required by government agencies. And guidelines, and a number of recommendations and guidelines have been developed to reduce business efforts, cost, and time in meeting various regulatory requirements. So the principle among them is the use of its data model, so which is a collection of international standards on data and information not only required by customs, but also by other government agencies in relation to the regulation of cross-border trade. So we try to, make the customs standards together with the international accepted standards. So the WCO, another WCO's tool is the time release study, so which provides the guidance on the best way to review jointly with other agencies in the cross-border and coordinated management environment. So the time required for the release of goods and to take potential corrective measures for continuous improvement of their border procedures. So a number of countries are using this tool for not only measuring performance and taking new policy measures, but also to carry out impact analysis, whether new initiatives are leading to desired goals. So, another important thing is that to help the developing and least developing countries to deal with the challenges of inadequate transport infrastructure and cumbersome transit procedures. So the customs, particularly those landlocked countries. So the WCO has recently published a transit handbook to assist the customs administrations in developing an efficient and effective transit system. So all in all, trade and transport facilitation has been seen as part of a broader development strategy as whole government approach that not only improves the country's competitiveness, but also enhance the introduction of new technologies, good governance, and capacity development for larger benefits of the global economy and society. So, thank you.
Thank you. You've mentioned there a lot of initiatives, and I would be interested, from the list to invite you to comment a bit more on one or two of them. You talked about the time release study, and as I understand, it's an attempt to measure performance and how long it takes to clear the system. Could you tell us, from the data that you know, within WCO, between the best case and the worst case, what are we dealing with to do with time release in hours, days, weeks, whatever it could be?
So far, we do not have the best and the worst practice, because from country to country, it's different. And another thing is, this is very sensitive in many countries. Personally, I was the Director General for International Cooperation before I came to the WCO. Mm-hmm. So I organized this TRS study for 3 consecutive years in China for several regional customs. So I found, of course, including air, land, and maritime. So in the end, we measured in China, so the part for the clearance of customs is not so large, so not so big as people imagine. Because once I discussed with IIU Secretary General, I say, the time staying at the borders accounts for 51% of the whole time of the transportation. So he thinks most of them is customs. I explained to him, not so. It's not only customs. Customs is only part of that. So that's why we promote coordinated border management. We try to involve other agencies on board to solve this issue. We cannot accuse other agencies because they have their legal responsibilities, but we can only to tell people this is the fact. For example, in some countries, there are tens of agencies For example, I talked with the Director General for Cambodian Customs. He told me, how can we, facilitate? Because we have 32 agencies at the borders, and customs is not a major one. How can we convince them to release the goods as fast as customs? I'm not sure customs is so fast, but you see, how can we do that? So that's the problem. That's why we now, on the one hand, we do the research of TRS. On the other side, we try to promote coordinated border management to involve other agencies on board, and we promote single window. We have delivered the single window compendiums, and we try to encourage one-stop shop. So we are doing all we can to push on all areas.
The one-stop shop, again, this clearly makes sense, that it's easy to handle the documentation and easy to move through the system. It is a perfectly valid and perfectly correct objective. To do with the journey towards realizing it, at which point, if we were going on a scale of 1 to 10, how far down the journey is WCO gone yet with its members?
Personally, from my personal experiences and so many meetings, seminars, or whatever, I think there are one thing very important, that is political will. So this issue cannot be addressed at the technical or expert level. So they cannot change the situation, because the most obvious situation is that the agencies at the borders, they have their own legal responsibilities. So however good, however strong the collaboration and cooperation is, they cannot give up their legal responsibilities. So then only the political will at a very high level, they decide there should be one who will take the lead. So for example, in the past, before the cooperation, the collaboration is so close, so there are 5 agencies. They have to inspect the consignment 5 times. Maybe they will ask the consignment to move to their warehouse. After they cooperate so well, so collaboration is so tight, but they still to inspect 5 times, because they cannot give up their legal responsibility. We have a very good example from Netherlands. Finally, they changed the situation. The government say, okay, customs, you take the lead. The other agencies stay behind. So they reduced the 5 inspection to 1. So unless something suspicious is found, which is relevant to other agencies, they will ask other agencies to come forward to check. Then, otherwise, the consignment, the goods will be released after only 1 inspection. So I think that's a part of a big step move to one-stop shop.
Sure. Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. Let me turn then to Klaus Tilmes, the director from the World Bank. You're, of course, accompanying states in development policy, and so you have a pretty global view, which I guess runs across many of these issues we've discussed. I leave it to you to pick from that menu. But these issues of infrastructure quality, human capital development and personal training and formation, the inertia of bureaucracy. So there's the legal system, that everyone has their legal duty to perform, and there's also the self-preservation logic in many public bureaucracies, and I don't just speak of customs and security, where if you're there, it's very hard to shift you no matter what the political will may be. All of those things you must have a sense of, and I'd be very interested to have your perspective.
Thank you very much, Pat. And indeed, I noticed that the panel has a heated agreement in terms of how important this issue actually is. I think competitiveness and supply chain efficiencies are absolutely vital today, no matter whether you're in Canada or whether you're trying to solve the problems of Tunisia. And in some way, that's also the consensus view of economists. For once, they all agree that if you really want to have an impact on poverty, trade is the the deal breaker, if you will. And then where we come in is we offer a range of services, technical advice, analytics, global advocacy, partnerships with other international organizations. So it really takes a village almost of initiatives to really mobilize this amount of forward movement. What I found really interesting when you start talking about this topic of trade and transport is to look at some of the data. And for some of our clients, that is a really big concern. If you look at the Logistics Performance Index or the Doing Business Index, there are huge gaps, particularly in terms of trade and transport facilitation. And today, very briefly, I mean, trade costs for developing countries are 2 to 3 times higher on average than those faced by developed economies. That gives you sort of a sense of what the challenges are. And what is particularly a source of concern is the unreliability and the unpredictability of supply chains. So the result is, if nowadays 80% of global trade is somehow connected to global value chains, not able to really make progress on this one means that the opportunities really escape many developing countries. And just sort of, we mentioned container dwell times, 2 to 4 days in OECD countries, often more than 2 weeks in developing countries. Landlocked countries often have 9 days more in terms of actually clearing products. So if you look at an SME in Kigali in Rwanda trying to get its agro products to Mombasa, that is a absolute vital challenge that they need to address in order to actually create employment. So we're also working very intensively with the WTO in terms of getting this trade facilitation agreement approved. I think that there's a lot of momentum behind this. But I think what is more important than just the legal agreement is to actually build the capabilities. As Mr. Zhu mentioned, there is a lot that needs to happen at border agencies, but also actually beyond border agencies. Now, since you mentioned the case of Cambodia and sort of the intergovernmental challenges there, I actually wanted to pick on Cambodia because in some way Cambodia is for us also a really interesting positive case study. The performance since 2010 on the logistics index, Cambodia has actually risen by 46 points. Poverty has dropped from 53 to 20%. And a lot of this has been really then allowed an increase in agribusiness, in export-focused manufacturing, and that in a nutshell is actually the type of positive virtuous cycle that we want to see between trade, economic growth, and poverty elimination. I think what is also clear is we need a comprehensive approach, and in some way that is sort of the bane of actually making these type of promises come into reality. What we need is coordinated planning, comprehensive thinking, and consistent implementation across 3 key areas. One is on infrastructure, the second one is on regulatory reforms and public-private dialogue, but then also sort of looking at the whole order management and facilitation of procedures. And since you mentioned the question of skill gaps, one maybe not so obvious entry point, but one that we are increasingly interested in is how do we upgrade the managerial qualities in some of these production facilities. And often these are very basic mechanisms or principles of managerial competency in terms of order management, in terms of actually just really creating a much more disciplined shop floor or firm level approach to operating in supply chain. And I think that's where a lot of the capacities also need to be strengthened. From our point of view, when we look at sort of across the globe in terms of where the demand is, what I found certainly over the last year or year and a half really interesting is the amount of awareness on the part of policymakers to look for development corridors and really to think much more regionally. There are at this point at least 3 different operations that we are working on in terms of regional trade and transport corridor projects in Africa, West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa. And there's obviously a lot of demand in Central Asia, in Southeast Asia, Central America, China. So my sense is that as far as the policymakers at the highest level are concerned, they clearly see the potential. Now, one of the biggest problems, of course, is actually the intergovernmental coordination. And I think on this one, trade facilitation, the building up of credible governed, transparent custom and border management systems, I think is very critical, because without having that level of credibility in place, it's very difficult, impossible to assume that a private investor is going to really put in a lot of sunk capital without being assured that this is functioning well. I think there's a real sense also from our discussion that the automation is a very important part, but again, automation in and of itself will not address some of the underlying governance challenges. And I think in particular for countries that are going through these political transitions, what is very important that regulatory reforms are not just put on the in law, but that they are actually being implemented. So it's really important to build regulatory reforms that are capture resistant, if you will. In some way, I think that's where the demand of the private sector is really, really important, because they're the ones who really ultimately are the test case in terms of whether or not this is convincing. Sort of overall, I would say that's sort of where we come in with sort of our advocacy, with our data, with our direct support, but it is clearly an area where there's huge promise and huge potential, and I think that's why we are here. So thank you.
Well, thank you for that, and I think your Cambodian example is a very interesting one. Could I just ask you, just to make it a bit concrete, I don't want to invite you, you can have your bilateral with the Tunisian minister off the panel, but taking Cambodia as an example, what kind of journey did you have with Cambodia? What were you doing, and others in partnership, to switch in what you've just described, to move up 46 points, to radically improve by whatever indices you've got of performance? Where did the journey start, and what were the key elements, the milestones, that made you know and they know that this journey is heading towards something successful?
Well, political stability, I think, was one. I think that there was a real sense that that is something that Cambodia's competitiveness was going to revolve around. We have provided in many, many different ways technical assistance on a whole range of topics, trade, transport, but also in terms of manufacturing. There was typically, this comes with a lot of implementation support on the ground in terms of business regulation, investment climate. Was an upgrading of manufacturing skills to really bring some of these export competitive sectors really up to speed. And I think, you know, ultimately what has been for Cambodia certainly been a real advantage is also the investment in skills, so that the manufacturing sector really started to become much more competitiveness. And I think that's what we are seeing. I mentioned it at the ministerial session, as we have all of these discussions, we have to really be careful in terms of, yes, praising some of the positive case studies, but at the same time, there are many countries which are looking at this and are really seeing this as a huge threat of being left behind. And I think that's probably the situation that Tunisia is facing, because articulating the political will is important, but at the same time, these are really decisions that require a lot more than just political will. There's the attractiveness of the location, there's the skill set of the population, there's the willingness of private investors to really make a bet on these countries. And Tunisia is a really fascinating case. I mean, tourism is one of the other subtexts of this conference, and tourism in Tunisia is one of the key export sectors. And so the question there is, how do you actually ensure a level of security, a level of comfort, that people are willing to actually return to this? So I think that is one of the key challenges, certainly that the Middle East is facing nowadays.
Je pense, Monsieur le Ministre, que vous voudrez intervenir. Allez-y.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Like my previous speakers have said, indeed, it's all about the political will. Is there political will or not? And there are positive cases like in Cambodia or Tunisia. However, Tunisia is also a bit of a negative example, as since 2010 and until today, since the revolution, in fact, we've had this index, and we lost 49 ranks. We were on rank 61 and now we are 110. So we were a very bad example. So what have we done so far? And I don't know whether that's sufficient. I take it it's not sufficient after all. However, we have made the commitment over the first 100 days to effect major change in people's everyday lives, or be it for investors. One aim was the port in Hades, the main port in Tunisia. So we had a look at what services are provided, what is the quality, what is the speed of service provision, and together with all stakeholders, so with the port, with the port authority, with the competent authorities in Tunisia, we defined aims, and we did that week after week, and we followed up on it in order to see whether there has been progress. So you have to monitor processes like that. There are clear improvements, but we still have our work cut out to achieve our aims. There is a lot of work to be done so that all services can be improved upon and so that we can act faster. And there is another tool. It is about polling the users, namely the Chamber of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry in Tunisia, for instance, and other chambers. Those chambers complained a lot, and those complaints and that criticism is very useful for us in order to inform all public bodies, government bodies, in order to show which measures need to be taken. And it is the users, it is the consumers who can say what they want and what quality of service provision they need in order for them to go about their transactions. So there has to be a monitoring process. A monitoring process has to be in place. I did not know what happened before, but there were relevant statistics. And now I've set up a monitoring point in order to watch all the indices. How many ships have arrived? How much time did it take for unloading? What was the dwell time? What was the waiting time? The cranes at the port. What kind of weight can they shift? How much time do they need in order to fill the container? And so on and so forth. So you can exert a certain amount of pressure. And you can put pressure on the service providers and improve the quality of services. So this is the kind of progress I've made, but I see there are organizations in the world looking into this matter, and I'm sure I will turn to some of you so that you can support me.
Talk to you before you go home. You have mentioned there, Minister, and it's very interesting, that one of the things already, which is very basic, but basic counts, you need to know the basic facts, and that these things you're trying to learn. Connecting facts is, connecting data is critical to the whole logistics space. And I'd like to thematically a little bit just explore that, if I might. I know that there's one intervention, there may be many interventions from the floor, but there's one I know here, if we can get a microphone to the second row. I will take, please, you can put your hands down, I will call you back in, so no worry. Can I go here to the, do we have a microphone? We do. Mr. Kenrali is from Finland, and I know this theme of data and connectivity he wants to talk about, and I want to use it to transition a little bit our discussion in that direction and to take whichever other points come from the floor. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Juha Kenrali. I'm from Finnish Transport Safety Agency. And I think the opening and sharing the data is one key element for both digital growth and economic growth. And we have quite good experience when we have opened the public data, and it really seems that it makes new innovations, makes new jobs and so on, business cases and so on. But it's obvious that that public data itself it's not enough. It's just a tiny proportion of all of the data. So it means that the actual data, the wholeness is somewhere else, and it's in the private sector. And that means that if it is very closed and it's not accessible, for example, for the small startups, small companies, which has quite a high investment ability, because they have just they are startups. And that's why they could have ideas, they could have an understanding how to do services and things like that in global world nowadays. And if we just think how those startups could get the data, I think it's only that open data way. So what should be done with that private sector? We know that there's a lot of companies who has that the business is that raw material, that raw data. But I think in the future the services are the added value business, not that raw data. So how this, or is it the business or market questions perhaps only, or is it, like I think it is just a political question as well. So should we do something that private sector should open the data, something, change the law or something like that, that they have to do that?
Okay, that's a really interesting question. Theo, I'm going to come to you, I don't want to be stereotyping, but you are the private sector, and last week, I have to tell Theo, who presides a Freight and Logistics Association in Europe, had a very interesting conference, and I had the ability to sit in and listen to a debate that they were having on data. So Theo, would you like to pick up this point? At one level, not sharing data constrains the whole system and is one of those links that slows the supply chain. At another level, companies are very sensitive about commercial data. And then the final level, to do with the security of data, once it's gone into a public domain, is itself a whole other debate. So Theo, your take as again, a hands-on practitioner in supply chaining.
Yeah, so if you look at the flow of goods in general, of course, if you have a container full with iPads or with iPhones, you don't want that data lying around, whether you have at the same time a container with plastic, low-cost plastic. So there is a lot of security. Some data you have no problem with sharing. There is other data that you want to be a little bit more careful of. They're more prone to theft or to security problems. So, but if you look at the global flow and the global trade, there is a certain amount of commonality in information that should be freely shared. And as private sector, we would have absolutely no problem. But where does the problem come in? That you have, we as big corporations, we run SAP systems, other people have Oracle, but then on top of that, there is an enormous forest of smaller companies that provide specific services, yeah, and they all have a good business model in helping you to bridge from your complicated corporate structure systems, yeah, to that external environment where there is an enormous amount of service providers, and somehow you have to connect them. And at that conference last week, this was one of the debates on how are we going to create some standard protocols, yeah, where we have the CMR convention, yeah, so for road, where we have the bill of ladings of houseway bills, yeah, how can we get to a minimum level of standardization, yeah, still finding a way to protect the intellectual property of the companies, or in some cases, the content of the things that they are moving around the world. And it's a bit like, you know, like I mentioned with my examples, you know, the world has become very small. Yeah, and if you look at the cost of moving things around, yeah, sometimes on short distances it's much more expensive than over long distances. And so we got to tackle this. So where in Europe we have a certain amount of automation already, but in the bigger world where it's now the playing field for many of us, yeah, we still have to develop a lot of these standard protocols, yeah, also for the customs and for other areas.
Theo, I had the impression last week, listening to many of your colleagues, that the point you made about having customized software because it's some particular thing or some particular legacy way of doing business has produced this impenetrable forest of alternatives, and marrying the protocols and making the handshakes across such a vast forest is probably technically an exceptionally difficult challenge, apart from the politics and apart from the privacy concerns.
Exactly, because many of these companies that are part of that forest of software providers, yeah, they all make a significant contribution, and within their model, since they are building the bridge, yeah, it's not so obvious that they have a shared interest to all go over the same bridge. Yeah? So it does need some policy, it does need some European approach or worldwide approach, yeah, whereby we agree on more standard protocols, yeah, that becomes the commonality, and then that you can have platforms where people can benefit from. Yeah, but set some sort of standard, like what was done somehow with customs, yeah, and with other areas.
Minister Leivik, you want to come in on this?
Just to say that this is an issue that we're living on a day-to-day basis. Exactly finding what was the role of government in ensuring there's a sharing of some data that can be helpful for the planning and the common kind of good, while at the same time respecting intellectual property, respecting commercial confidentiality, respecting security issues. We had a massive rail derailment in Canada with 47 people dead, and there's been a lot of interest in communities around information about transportation of dangerous goods. But from a security standpoint, I don't want to be putting a portal out there saying at 3:02 in the afternoon there's this kind of like a chlorine tank car moving around and that. Don't want to do that, but there's on the other end, first responders need the information. On the economic side, we are facing this issue in spades on the grain transportation because we have fundamentally two railways. It's a duopoly, and even in location, that is fundamentally a monopoly. And then there is a lot of tensions between the various parties, and that obviously we're asked to arbitrate, but it's getting the data, but what does the data mean? And what is we should protect, and what is it we should open? This is an ongoing issue that we're facing. And we're going to a complete review of our transportation economic framework legislation, and that I expect will be a key element.
So that's interesting. So you part answer by legislation is part, not all the answer, but part. Theo's answer is partly it's the protocols and getting some minimum common protocol standard. I'm standing up because with the light strong, I want to see where the hands are up. Can we go down to the gentleman here on the right-hand side? I'm going to take the comments or questions from the floor and then eventually return to the panel, if I may. Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Cox.
Vielen Dank, Herr Cox. Ich bin Markus Giorgetti, ich bin der Direktor von FIATA und wir arbeiten sehr viel mit diesen Themen, denn wir sind Teil dieses Forums von Tausenden von Unternehmen. Wir vertreten sie, es sind ungefähr 4000. Und wir arbeiten sehr gut mit der WTO zusammen, mit der WZO und Gao Zhangzhou. Aber die lasse ich jetzt in Ruhe. Ich habe eine Frage für Sie, Herr Zweigers, und dabei geht es um die Standards, denn das ist ein Thema, das Sie sehr stark unterstrichen haben. Ich habe viele Jahre innerhalb der ISO gearbeitet. Ich habe an verschiedenen Themen gearbeitet, bevor ich meine jetzige Stelle angenommen habe. Und das Credo der ISO ist, dass Standards von der Industrie getrieben werden und dass es darum geht, Standards zu entwickeln, die dann vervielfältigt werden können zum Nutzen der Industrie und so weiter. Was ich von Ihnen jetzt aber höre, erweckt bei mir den Anschein, dass es
Maybe the time has come for us to do a bit more in this direction so that we can actually come to common standards. I mean, I'll just give you an example. You gave the example of the 20-foot container and 40-foot container. Great. Well, we deal with 20-foot containers and 40-foot containers, but of course you know that we deal with 45-foot containers. And I was stopped just in the other room upstairs, and somebody gave me a very interesting study on the introduction, forthcoming and in the foreseeable future, of 53-foot containers that have another dimension. And I remember when I was working in Brussels, I was put up by the European Commission, and they wanted to make a statue of me because I said, we just want one box. And we load the one box as long as that box is a common standard. And of course, what we have is different boxes, and we continue having different boxes. And this seems to be sort of implanted in our DNA. Can we ever come to terms with this dichotomy and contradiction? Thank you.
Thank you, Theo. I'm going to get to hold the answer because I will come back to the panel. Yes, please, in the front row here.
Yes, Jose San Martin from the Mexican Transport Institute of the Ministry of Transportation in Mexico. I would like to hear a comment of Mr. Levesque, perhaps the World Bank too, about the following. We just had the resilience meeting a couple of hours ago, and we know that the world has become less secure, more uncertain, not only due to climate, new disasters, but also to political, regional conflicts, terrorism, organized crime, cybercrime, etc. And this has provoked more frequent and more severe ruptures in the logistic chains and its facilitation. So several industries are building up their new production strategy and returning to the regionalization, the nearshoring versus offshoring. This is happening within NAFTA, and that's the question for Mr. Levesque. More and more industries are returning to Mexico, mainly the automotive, aerospace, electronic industries, and manufacturing. For example, Bombardier is an example. The turbines and some parts in Querétaro, Mexico, others in Montreal, Toronto, and assembled in Massachusetts. I would like to know what Canada, and if he knows, Mr. Levesque knows a little bit more about US, in the policy making to facilitate even more this returning to this regionalization production.
Thank you very much. If we can come to the gentleman here on the front row on this side.
Wenn Sie gestatten, möchte ich meine Frage gerne auf Deutsch.
If you allow, I would like to ask my question in German. I am a journalist from Germany, and in Germany we have two issues, so I have a two-folded question. The first one is to Ms. Levesque and Mr. Zhu, and it is due to TTIP or CETA. And in Germany, the news situation is the following. What do we understand when we talk about TTIP? Okay, so the news situation on TTIP is very scarce, and you hardly ever learn anything about it. If you hear people in favor of TTIP, you hear that customs obstacles will be brought down. Other issues regard technical aspects, so something will be solved on a technical level. And here the question to Mr. Zhu is, will unemployment prevail in customs officers when TTIP is around? And the question to Mr. Levesque. In Germany, we often hear that CETA, which actually has been negotiated, works. So shouldn't TTIP be a backdoor for the United States to make a free trade zone with Europe possible? And the next question is to Mr. Romdan. You said Tunisia is a poor country. I have to say that from my point of view, I cannot confirm that. My wife likes to say that we have to travel to Tunisia and have to go there because the sun's shining 24/7 and you have a wealth of art, and there are other countries in Europe that used to be poor and now they are rich. And nevertheless, you said that you have to tackle challenges to bring your transport routes up to a modern standard. So wouldn't it be a good idea for you to get closer to the European Union? There are other countries such as Turkey or Azerbaijan or even Australia that are not so close to the European Union. Australia sent a participant to the European Song Contest this year. So maybe this would be an idea for Tunisia to get closer to the EU via Malta, for example. Thank you.
Let me go to the end here. We have a question on the left-hand side of the back. Can we get a microphone down there, please? And then I will return to the panel. So thank you very much for those contributions.
Vielen Dank, Stefan Schimming from.
Thank you very much, Stefan Zimming of the Ministry of Transport of the host country. I have a question with which I attempt to get back to the global perspective. We all know that customs is to do with frontiers and barriers. Frontiers are to do with independence. Independence is a good of a high value for many nations, both internally and externally. And this, in turn, is to do with the fact that there are countries where infrastructure measures and human resources measures are very important. These frontiers and borders, in many cases, and we've heard many examples, stand for jobs, for social security, and the borders also stand for a national income. This is the understanding that in many nations today still find. And on the other hand, we have institutions such as the WZO and the World Bank, and the economic benefit of freer, more liberal conditions on borders in terms of the national income and the welfare and the GDP of the nations are a lot more profitable than what is connected to borders in terms of hope. We've heard a lot about different models here on this conference. So are there any models that you have that allow you to tell these nations that this is where they should start? These are the developments. And the question is, how can you tell them that it makes a lot more sense to bring down these borders and to liberalize external trade mechanisms and to convince them that the benefit for their country in terms of liberalization can be reached more easily than it can be reached with trying to close oneself off or to protect oneself from the outside? Thank you.
Panel, what in effect is a closing round, because I'm keeping an eye on our schedule here. We want to run the train more or less on time. Theo, you were asked the question about the protocols and the standards, that the classic industry position, ISO and so on, should be industry driven, but maybe that's kind of exhausted the possibilities. Is something more needed?
Yeah, I think something more is needed. We're going to need to have some sort of protocols. So we got to have, at the European level, this needs to be worked at. Yeah. So like you were last week in that conference. Yeah. So as an industry, we work in the chemical industry. We have platforms where we meet with all our peers and we work on standardization, on best practices, how we secure loads, how we load containers, how we deal with moving goods around. And then the second part that I do, which what was happening last week, is like cross-industry. So where we bring together fast-moving consumer goods, food, chemicals, all sorts of other industries, and we start to cross-share what we do in chemical. We start to cross-share across other industries and try to drive that as shippers, as a broad group of people that move goods around the world, start to create a process of convergence. Yeah? Not that we have immediately a solution of how the protocols should look like and how we're going to convince, yeah, but having more parties all aligning and working towards the same objective. Yeah? And we're going to need help from governments. We're going to need help from European institutions, yeah, to steer that alignment. But as an industry, we're trying to pull this together, yeah, and we're trying to steer it. Yeah, and it's not that we want to get rid of these small entrepreneurs or companies that help us to bridge. No, they should remain. Yeah, they are providing us a value. Yeah, but we need to get some commonality, some umbrella on the top. Yeah, that helps us to connect to the wider world in a standardized format.
Okay, so it sounds like an appeal for partnership rather than takeover in terms of the combination. Monsieur le ministre, on vous a posé la question sur la proximité de la Tunisie.
Mr. Romain, we've heard the question about Tunisia and its location close to the European Union. Of course, in geographic terms, the distance to the European Union is not so large, so it's more of a political question. Thank you. Yes. 80% of Tunisia's exchange are done with the European Union in terms of exports and imports, and even the population migrates to the European Union, or there are many Tunisians living abroad, and 70% of them have come to Europe. So, of course, there is a kind of closeness and economical close distance, and there are different mechanisms behind it. The first thing that we've done is the free exchange of goods. In 1995, Tunisia has introduced the free trade of goods, and now European products can travel to Tunisia freely without paying tariffs, and the other way around, Tunisian products can be imported to the European Union, of course, under the prerequisite that certain standards are complied with in terms of hygiene and health, so these conditions have to be fulfilled. Up until now, the situation was such that Tunisia was an authoritarian regime. In political terms, the country was not able to fulfill the essential criteria of democracy with the former regime. Tunisia intended to achieve a special status and to get closer to the European Union, but this position of a privileged partnership never happened. But now the situation is such that the European Union regards Tunisia as a privileged country or a privileged partner. However, The current situation is such that the current Tunisian government wants to get even closer to Europe. We want to become an associated member of the European Union, and that means everything but being entitled to vote in the European institutions. We want to become a partner like Norway or other countries. We want to be an associated country. We want to use the entire range of programs, with the exception of voting, of course. And we do everything that is required so as to achieve that new status. I would like to correct myself. I am not saying that Tunisia is a poor country. What I am saying is that we do not have any natural resources, that is, raw materials, in other words. But to become an associated member, or at least to achieve that, this means for us that we can achieve another level of wealth and well-being. It means for us that we can participate in this social range, but for us a prerequisite is to carry out certain reforms of our institutions, of our economy, and we want to do that so as to achieve a higher level, so that in 20 or 30 years' time, we are a country with a high level of wealth and well-being. It is very important to consolidate this situation.
And all of the issues about supply chain predictability or security is causing the system to shift back towards near sourcing in its form of outsourcing rather than long-distance supply chaining. And the second question was a question to you about TTIP, what your take is, and the issue, was it more about taking down customs barriers, or is it more about the standards question?
Looking at it from a Canadian perspective, what we see is that it is on our interest to have reduction of barriers in terms of both with countries in Pacific Rim. We have an agreement with the U.S. We're doing an agreement with Europe, notably in the context of a world where it's a supply chain world. So for us SMEs and for our businesses, it's about integrating yourself more and more in the supply chains of like Fortune 500 companies. So that being the premise and being open to trade being good, a couple of points related to that. On the reshoring, well, there's many factors that can play into this. Transportation costs, in terms of energy costs can play into this. As long as they're a market-based factor, the Canadian government doesn't have a policy in favor against. It's basically businesses making decisions based on cost and the logic of supply chain to kind of move in terms of products. So, and we think on the long run, by specialization, that's how in terms of living standards in our country will go up. Obviously, if that's happening because of major risks in terms on the security front, because people are seeing that parts of the world are unstable and they're really making decisions based on that, I think it's a loss to everybody. It just means that the system, either costs are built in, risk costs that are built in the system, and private sector actors will react on the basis of their assessment of risk, but that to some extent it shows the cost that we're paying, and we've been discussing this panel on aviation security, and I may want to do all kinds of things to facilitate, but the facts of life are, post 9/11, a massive cost have been imposed on air travel because of actions against the United States. And we need to prevent that, but then we need to spend real resources ensuring the security of people. And I think I've more or less answered the TTIP question with saying, we have this agreement with Europe, and we see this as important because not only the supply chain logic and the space, the economic space of Europe, but the fact that the U.S. would have such an agreement, it is totally reasonable for the U.S. to try to do that. And the important thing for us, and then we already built that into that agreement, is notably accumulation of rules of origins and all of that, so that we're not caught off outside. And so we view this as a natural development.
Let me ask you, Mr. Zhou, on you were asked the TTIP question and this issue about the the dualism between prizing independence and border control on the one part, and minimizing the blockage that may happen at a border to maximize economic welfare.
So you can see from my name that it's a compliance and facilitation. Here, how to maximize the facilitation while maintain the how to say, effective control at the border. So you see, the customs now, our purpose is to how to build up a secure, facilitated, and a resilient supply chain. So such a supply chain, because the supply chain transits borders. So any disruption at any part of the supply chain could have a major impact, miles or even 1,000 miles away. So when we maximize this facilitation, we have to keep in mind the customs duty to, how to say, guarantee the security. So my personal view is that we try to ensure the highest compliance. So the higher the compliance, the higher the facilitation, the higher the revenue, the more secure the supply chain, the safer the society. So that's always my point of view when I exchange with private sectors. Because we, in the WCO, we have a private sector consultation group. So we always have discussions with them, involve them in the process of setting standards. So how to guarantee that? It is always our goal, because there are two sides of the same coin. We cannot overstress one side at the expenses of the other. Yeah. So the customs duty is to enforce, customs responsibility to facilitate. So without duty, no responsibility. So how to ensure the highest compliance is our, how to say, goal, to try to make that a reality, to realize that. So before my end of my question, I would like to answer your previous question you asked me.
Yes.
So if there is any extreme examples, the best practice and the worst practice of the WCO information, I did not say we have official information from the WCO, but from me, my research or we have two extreme examples. So one is take a container, the clearance of a container, for example, in Singapore, the average time is 4 days, and the cost is $425. But for Chad, another extreme, may not be the worst. For Chad, the average time is 101 days. And the cost is $8,075. So it's from my personal, how to say, research, but this is not the official WCO information.
Oh, that is extreme. It shows a huge range and room for efficiency and productivity improvement.
Tens of times. Sure. That means the poorer the country, the price of the commodities are the higher.
Yeah.
So it's. So that's why we try to.
Thank you very much for that. I know you took off your official hat, but it's good to have your personal observation. Okay. Thank you very much. Klaus Tillmans, I leave it to you to really wrap up. You've heard the questions, you've been in the discussion, so I'll let you close out.
I just wanted to make one point on data. I mean, I really appreciate what the Finnish colleague mentioned in terms of how important this is. There are sort of 2 points that are critical for us. One is data really trigger reform. The Doing Business indicator has been a huge worldwide leader in terms of really getting the attention of decision makers. And the second one, and I think that's where a lot of the real interest from us is, private data really can actually help governments become much more accountable for following up. And I think the publication of all the freight data on air shipment is one of those examples where you can really sort of set up a benchmark in terms of, well, have those laws on the book actually been implemented? And I think that's the type of feedback mechanism that we, from a policy point of view, are really interested in. Now, there were some very interesting questions in terms of, we don't have a policy in terms of, similar to Minister Levesque, we believe it's really the private sector who makes these decisions. Where we see a lot of potential is in terms of also regional value chains, particularly, let's say, in Africa. And I would just sort of say on this one, we see a lot of demand on the part of national governments to really make headways on this one. And where the weak link is on this one, a lot of the regional organizations, these are the ones that are not nearly as developed and are not nearly as competent as would be necessary in order to make this work. Because ultimately what matters is, are the border and clearance procedures between two countries compatible? And if they are not, single national actions is really not going to make a difference. But I would say overall, I really hope that some of the promises for 2015 are really coming through, because I think what we would really like to see is a really breakthrough on trade and value chains combined. And I think that's hopefully the year where this is taking place. I think we have all been waiting for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of you. We've run over a little bit, so thank you for your patience. I want to thank our interpreters for assisting us with the translation. To, of course, thank our panel, and I would ask you to show your appreciation for the panel. Thank you very much indeed. Voilà. Merci.